Have you ever felt your mind turn into an endless labyrinth of thoughts where each idea reflects like in a mirror, creating even more worries? In 1 second, you're thinking about a deadline that is relentlessly approaching, and in the next, about a conversation you've been avoiding for weeks. These worries seem to multiply like shadows in a room where a faint light flashes but doesn't offer a real escape. We seem to get stuck in our anxiety, not realizing that the key to freedom lies not in suppressing anxiety, but in understanding it in its true causes. It is here that Jung leads us to the most important thought. Anxiety is not an enemy, but a clue. It points to those internal conflicts that we have not yet dared to recognize. Our fears, doubts, and anxious thoughts are merely signals that can help us understand ourselves better. Instead of trying to silence them, we need to ask ourselves, what is really behind this anxiety? The answer to this question lies in the depths of our past. Since childhood, we are taught that there are emotions that are better not to show: fear, anger, and uncertainty. We are told that being vulnerable means being weak, and therefore we learn to suppress our true feelings. But they don't disappear. They go into our subconscious, into the shadow that Jung spoke of, and begin to affect us imperceptibly. Often, the anxiety we experience in adulthood is merely an echo of what we experienced in the past. For example, if we were often criticized as children, even in adulthood, we may fear failure, feeling anxiety before every important step. Or if we were rejected in our youth, it can make us more sensitive to rejection in the future, even when there is essentially no threat. These psychological mechanisms work subtly but constantly. We may think we are worried about work, relationships, or the future, but in reality, the root of anxiety is much deeper. It's not just a fear of specific situations, but a manifestation of our internal beliefs about ourselves and the world. Jung believed that the only way to get rid of destructive anxiety is to realize where it comes from. When we understand its true causes, it ceases to be something unmanageable. Instead of vague fears, we begin to see real psychological triggers that can be worked through. Thus, anxiety is not just an emotional reaction, but a key to our inner world. It helps us see what was hidden and realize what beliefs and fears control us. But how exactly is anxiety formed within us? And what mechanisms operate in our daily lives? To understand this, let's delve deeper into how the psychological roots of anxiety affect our personality and perception of the world. Anxiety doesn't appear out of nowhere. It forms within us from early childhood, weaving into our experiences, beliefs, and defense mechanisms. Often it becomes a result of suppressed emotions, unrealized desires, and fear of the unknown. Our mind, striving to protect us from pain, creates avoidance mechanisms, but ultimately they lead to even greater anxiety. Since childhood, we are taught to hide vulnerability. Don't cry, don't be afraid, be strong. Such attitudes force us to suppress emotions instead of learning to understand them. We get used to ignoring our fears, anxieties, and doubts, but they don't disappear. They simply go deeper, becoming part of our shadow, the side of our personality that we refuse to acknowledge. However, suppressed emotions always find a way to manifest. Sometimes it happens in the form of uncontrolled anxiety when the mind gets fixated on hypothetical threats. Sometimes in the form of perfectionism, striving for control, or constant worry about the future. A person may think they are anxious about work, relationships, or finances, but in reality, the reason lies not in these situations, but in their internal attitudes and emotional traumas. The mind creates more and more images of problems until you find yourself trapped in your own anxiety, unable to break free from this endless stream of thoughts. But what if I told you that anxiety is not reality, but a game of the mind? What if the fears you experience are no more than illusions created by your mind, keeping you in a state of stress and internal tension? Jung emphasized that anxiety is often a reflection of our deep-seated fear of the unknown. We fear not only specific events, but also our own vulnerability to life. We want to be confident in tomorrow, to have clear guarantees of safety. However, the reality is that absolute control doesn't exist. When we don't realize these mechanisms, anxiety becomes a constant companion. We begin to seek safety in predicting the future. But the more we try to foresee possible threats, the more we get stuck in anxious thoughts. The mind convinces us that if we constantly think about problems, we can prevent them. But in reality, it only creates an endless cycle of worry from which it is difficult to escape. We are, as it were, stuck in our anxiety, not realizing that the key to freedom lies not in suppressing anxiety, but in understanding its roots and origins. This is one of the most insidious traps of anxiety, the illusion of control. It seems to us that if we think about a problem long enough, analyze possible scenarios, we can avoid negative consequences. We convince ourselves to prepare for the worst, although in reality it only exhausts our mind. Such thinking is comparable to running on a treadmill. We expend energy but stay in place. We create endless mental scenarios, but they don't make us more secure. Rather, on the contrary, they only increase internal tension. The more we try to control the future, the more our brain generates frightening thoughts, and we find ourselves in a vicious cycle. Jung called this the ego trap, a state when a person is so attached to their fears that they subconsciously feed them. Our mind begins to perceive anxiety as a way of survival, but in reality, it simply keeps us in a state of constant stress. The problem is exacerbated by the fact that the modern world only intensifies this dynamic. Social networks, news streams, and the high pace of life, all of this creates the illusion that we must constantly be on guard. It seems to us that if we lose control, something terrible will definitely happen. However, the truth is that absolute control does not exist. So how do we get out of this endless cycle? How do we stop being a hostage to anxious thinking and learn to perceive life differently? The answer lies in understanding the very mechanism of anxiety and in the ability to learn to let go of what cannot be controlled. To understand how to do this, let's consider what practical steps can help us escape this trap. We live in a world where we are taught from childhood that control is power. It seems to us that if we can predict the future, calculate risks, and foresee all possible scenarios, we will avoid suffering. However, the paradox is that it is this attempt to control everything that generates anxiety. When the mind gets fixated on searching for threats, it begins to see them even where they do not exist. We turn into prisoners of our own thoughts, repeatedly scrolling through possible negative outcomes. This is the main trap of anxious thinking. It creates an illusion of preparation, but in reality, it only exhausts us. We do not solve problems. We simply think about them endlessly. The more we worry, the more our brain gets used to the state, turning it into the norm. It begins to seem to us that anxiety helps us, although in reality it only keeps us in an endless cycle of tension. Jung called this the ego trap, a state when a person is so attached to their fears that they subconsciously feeds them. We create scenarios of catastrophes in our minds, but at the same time we forget that most of them never happen. We tend to see anxiety as an important indicator of future threats. But how often do our premonitions come true? How often do we worry about things that ultimately don't happen? Carl Jung, one of the most profound thinkers in the history of psychology, argued that anxiety is not simply a fear of the unknown, but a reflection of our inner shadow. It's like a horror, but today when there are fewer real dangers, this mechanism has not disappeared. Our mind continues to look for dangers, even if they do not exist, turning ordinary life difficulties into threats to survival. But is there a way out of this trap? Can we learn to live without constant worry? The answer is yes. Jung argued that the key to freedom lies not in fighting anxiety, but in changing our attitude towards it. If we stop seeing it as an enemy and start perceiving it as a signal indicating deeper internal processes, we can break this cycle. The first thing to realize is that anxiety is not a real threat. It is merely a mental process that has no power over you. If you learn to notice it and not get involved in it, most anxious thoughts are not facts but hypotheses that our mind creates based on past experiences. And Jung advised treating anxiety as a shadow that accompanies us, but does not define our personality. Instead of trying to get rid of it, it is important to learn to observe it. Imagine that your anxious thoughts are clouds floating in the sky. You can look at them, recognize them, but you don't have to merge with them. Conscious self-observation is one of the most effective tools in dealing with anxiety. When you notice that you are starting to scroll through negative scenarios again, take a pause. Ask yourself, is this a real threat or just my habit of worrying? Such a simple question will help you regain control over your state. Another important step is to abandon the illusion of control. Accept the fact that in life there will always be things that cannot be predicted or prevented. The more you allow yourself to trust the process of life, the less your mind will need constant anxiety. But how to learn this in practice? What specific steps will help us rethink our attitude towards worry? To understand this in more detail, let's consider mindfulness techniques that will help us gain inner freedom. To change your attitude towards anxiety, you need to realize that fighting it only fuels it. The more we resist our inner shadows, the stronger they become. Jung argued that anxiety is not an enemy, but a signal that indicates deep inner processes. Instead of trying to suppress it, it is important to ask yourself what it is trying to tell me. Sometimes anxiety indicates that we are ignoring our true desires or are afraid of changes. In other cases, it is a reflection of unresolved past traumas. If we consider anxiety as a message rather than a threat, our attitude towards it changes. We cease to see it as a punishment and begin to use it as a tool for self-knowledge. One way to change your attitude towards anxiety is to change your internal dialogue. Instead of thinking, I can't handle it, or this is terrible, try telling yourself, this is just an emotion and it will pass, or I am capable of dealing with this. By rebuilding the internal monologue, we change not only our perception of anxiety, but also the level of its influence on us. It is also important to realize that anxiety does not provide real protection from future troubles. He viewed anxiety as a result of unresolved internal conflicts and emotions that we have suppressed or are trying to ignore. It's not just fears of external events, but a reflection of what is hidden in our subconscious, what we are afraid to face head on. But if anxiety is a reflection of our internal shadows, can we learn to manage it? Often we think that if we worry in advance, we will prepare for the worst. But in practice, worry only takes away energy without giving concrete solutions. The only way to really prepare is to act and not to worry. A key step is to learn to stay in the present moment. Most anxious thoughts are either about the past, which can no longer be changed, or about the future, which has not yet arrived. When we focus on the present moment, anxiety loses its power. Jung emphasized that anxiety weakens when we begin to be aware of emotions and not ignore them. When we give ourselves permission to experience anxiety without fear, it ceases to control us. But how exactly do we learn such conscious perception? What methods will help us understand ourselves and gain inner peace? One of the most effective ways to work with anxiety is conscious self-observation. This is a process where we not only experience emotions, but also observe their nature. Instead of merging with anxious thoughts, try to imagine them as a stream that you are watching from the side. Reflective writing is another powerful technique. When you write down your anxious thoughts on paper, they cease to seem chaotic. This method helps to structure emotions, see recurring patterns, and realize the deep causes of your worries. It is also useful to practice breathing exercises. Deep, conscious breathing helps to switch attention from anxious thoughts to physical sensations. This reduces stress levels and helps to regain control over emotions. Working with bodily sensations also plays an important role. Jung believed that many of our anxieties live not only in the mind, but also in the body. Practices like yoga, meditation, or walks in the fresh air help to relieve tension and restore balance. But the most important thing is to learn to accept anxiety, not to fight it. Acceptance does not mean smyrenia, but rather awareness that anxiety is part of the human experience. When we stop fearing it and begin to see it as a source of self-knowledge, it loses its destructive power and becomes our ally. Mindfulness is the ability to observe your thoughts and emotions without judgment. When we are aware of anxiety and not just succumbing to it, it ceases to control us. One way to develop mindfulness is meditation, observing your thoughts. Imagine that you are sitting by a river and your anxious thoughts are leaves floating on the water. You are not trying to stop them, not analyzing them. You are simply watching how they appear and disappear. Reflection through writing is another powerful tool. When you write out your worries, they cease to seem like a formless chaos. Write down what exactly is bothering you, what scenarios your mind is drawing, and ask yourself how realistic this is. Can we stop being its prisoner and transform it into an instrument of awareness and personal growth? Jung believed that not only is it possible, but necessary. After all, anxiety, like any emotion, is not our enemy. It merely points to those parts of us that require attention and understanding. To truly understand the nature of anxiety, let's delve deeper into Jung's perspective on its roots and mechanisms. Most often, anxious thoughts turn out to be exaggerated or even irrational. Breathing practices help to regain control over emotions. Deep conscious breathing slows the heart rate and reduces stress levels. One effective method is the 4-7-8 technique. Inhale for 4 seconds, hold your breath for 7 seconds, and exhale slowly for 8 seconds. This helps to calm the nervous system and reduce anxiety. Physical activity also plays an important role. Jung emphasized that our body and mind are connected, and anxiety often accumulates in muscle tension. Simple walks, stretching, or yoga help to relieve physical tension, and as a result, calm the mind. The practice of gratitude can radically change your perception of life. When we daily focus on what we already have and not on what we lack, anxiety gradually weakens. A gratitude journal is a simple but effective way to switch attention from worry to awareness of the positive aspects of life. But even if we use these practices, anxious scenarios in the head may continue to arise. They have become an automatic reaction, a pattern of thinking that has been forming for years. To break free from it, it is important to consciously change the internal dialogue and work with deep-seated beliefs. Anxious thinking is not just a set of random thoughts, but a habitual scenario according to which our mind acts. It creates an illusion of predictability and control, but in reality only silhouette fear. Therefore, the first step towards changing it is to realize that anxious thoughts do not always reflect reality. One method is the technique of cognitive restructuring. Ask yourself, what evidence do I have that this is really the case? For example, if you think, I will definitely fail, try to find examples from the past where you coped with difficulties. This helps to destroy irrational beliefs. Another way is to replace anxious attitudes with more balanced ones. Instead of saying, I can't handle it, tell yourself, I have faced difficulties many times before and found a way out. Over time, the brain gets used to a new scenario of thinking and anxiety begins to weaken. It is also important to learn to notice automatic reactions. Often, anxious thoughts arise instantly, like a reflex. Try every time you notice anxiety, not just suppress it, but realize, here is that thought again. What is it trying to tell me? This creates distance between you and the anxious scenario. Changing anxious thinking is a process that takes time and awareness. But the more often we practice new approaches, the easier it becomes to control our internal state. In the next section, we will consider specific strategies that will help you rebuild your mind and make anxiety not an obstacle, but a tool for personal growth. Changing anxious thinking is not a momentary process, but a gradual awareness of how your mind works. Every time anxious thoughts begin to dominate, it is important to remind yourself that they are not an objective reality, but merely an interpretation of events. Our mind is used to looking for threats, but this does not mean that all our fears are justified. The practice of conscious thinking helps to break this cycle. Carl Jung asserted that anxiety is not merely a reaction to the external world, but something much deeper. It doesn't appear out of nowhere. It arises from within ourselves, from our unresolved internal conflicts. When a person encounters anxiety, they often try to suppress it, run away from it, or distract themselves from it. When anxiety starts to build, take a pause and ask yourself, is this a real problem, or am I just exaggerating the threat? Such a simple question can change your reaction and prevent anxiety from taking over your consciousness. Another effective method is consciously perclucid focus of attention. Instead of concentrating on what could go wrong, try to consciously look for evidence to the contrary. For example, if you're afraid that you will not cope with a task, remember moments when you successfully solved similar problems. Positive reevaluation of anxiety also plays an important role. Instead of perceiving anxiety as weakness, try to see it as a signal indicating areas in which you need to develop confidence and trust in yourself. It is also important to learn to distinguish between a real problem and an anxious scenario. If anxiety is related to a specific situation, ask yourself what I can do right now. If there is no answer, then anxiety is not of real benefit and it can be released. Jung emphasized that anxious thoughts are often created by our ego, which seeks to control everything. But life is unpredictable. And the more we try to keep everything under control, the realization of this fact can be the first step to true liberation. The key is to recognize anxiety for what it is, a mental construct, a collection of thoughts and sensations that have power over us, but only if we give in to them. As soon as we realize that anxiety is just one of many possible interpretations of reality, we get the opportunity to change our reaction to it. But there is another important step that allows us to finally get out of the trap of anxious thinking. This is not fighting and not suppressing anxiety, but radical acceptance. Instead of trying to control every aspect of life, you can learn to trust the process, accept uncertainty, and find peace in the present moment. Acceptance does not mean inaction or smerenia before circumstances. It is an awareness that life is full of changes, and not everything in it is subject to our control. Jung argued that anxiety increases when we fight reality instead of accepting it as it is. Many of our anxieties are related to attempts to avoid uncertainty. We want to know how everything will turn out, to predict the future and eliminate all risks, but the truth is that absolute control does not exist. The only thing that is really in our power is how we react to what is happening. When we accept this fact, anxiety begins to weaken. Instead of spending energy on attempts to predict the future, we learn to live here and now. We begin to understand that each situation carries not only threats but also opportunities. The practice of radical acceptance consists in awareness of your emotions without attempts to suppress them. If you feel anxiety, do not try to get rid of it immediately. Instead, allow yourself to feel it, acknowledge its existence, and say to yourself, "Now I am experiencing anxiety and this is normal." It is also important to realize that trust in life is not passivity, but an internal confidence that you are able to cope with any. However, Jung believed that such an approach only exacerbates the problem. Everything we try to ignore finds a way to manifest again. According to him, anxiety is closely linked to the so-called shadow, the part of our personality that we don't want to acknowledge. In this shadow lie our suppressed fears, unfulfilled desires, complexes, and memories that we try to forget. Circumstances. This is the ability to see beyond fear and understand that even if something goes wrong, you always have resources to cope with it. When we stop perceiving anxiety as an enemy and start trusting the process of life, we gain true freedom. We no longer get stuck in mental traps, do not live in constant fear of the future, but accept every moment as it is, and this is perhaps one of the deepest changes that can be brought into one's life, because true peace is not the absence of anxiety, but the ability to live with it, not allowing it to control you. In the next section, we will consider how the practices of gratitude, mindfulness, and inner work may be key tools on the path to inner freedom. Radical acceptance is not passive smerenia before circumstances, but a conscious choice to interact with life without undue resistance. Jung believed that many of the sufferings of man occur not because of the events themselves, but because we are not ready to accept them as they are. When we fight reality, refusing to acknowledge inevitable changes, we only increase anxiety. Often we think that if we stop worrying, we will lose vigilance and make a mistake. But in reality, anxiety does not make us more prepared. It only exhausts us. True trust in life begins when we realize that we cannot control everything, but we can always control our reaction. Jung emphasized that trust in life requires deep inner work. This is not a blind belief that everything will be fine, but confidence that we can cope with any challenges. Instead of building protective barriers and trying to eliminate all possible risks, we learn to be flexible, adaptable, and open to change. One of the key aspects of radical acceptance is awareness that uncertainty is a natural part of life. We can never fully know what awaits us in the future, and this is normal. Instead of perceiving uncertainty as a threat, we can consider it as an opportunity. The practice of trust in life includes the ability to let go of control. This does not mean that we stop making decisions or planning the future, but it means that we stop living in constant tension. We begin to understand that not all problems require immediate solutions, and not every anxious thought deserves our attention. When we accept this concept, anxiety begins to weaken. We stop trying to guess the future and start living in the present moment. We learn to notice beauty in everyday life, to see opportunities where we previously saw only threats. But to truly change your perception of anxiety, it is not enough just to use these mechanisms. You need to rebuild your internal attitude towards it, change the scenarios according to which our mind works. How to do this? Let's consider the next important step: rebuilding the internal perception of anxiety. Changing the perception of anxiety begins with realizing that it is not an enemy, but a signal. Instead of perceiving it as a hindrance, we can see in it an opportunity for self-knowledge. But the more we ignore them, the more they control us from within. Jung saw anxiety as an indicator that a person is refusing to look deep within themselves, avoiding self-knowledge. Moreover, he believed that anxiety often becomes a trap for the mind. Jung said that anxiety is a shadow indicating what we have not yet realized in ourselves. The first step to restructuring thinking is to change the focus. Instead of avoiding anxious thoughts, try to consider them as valuable messages from your subconscious. For example, if you are constantly worried about the fear of failure, this may mean that it is important for you to deal with issues of self-esteem and self-confidence. The second important aspect is conscious work with internal dialogue. Often anxiety increases because of how we talk to ourselves. Phrases like "I can't handle it" or "this is too scary" only strengthen anxious thinking. Consciously replacing them with more constructive statements, for example, "I have coped before and I will cope now," we gradually change our perception. Jung also said that anxiety increases when we are identified. A person constantly repeats, "I am anxious," he literally makes anxiety part of his identity. But anxiety is not a characteristic of personality, but a temporary state that can be changed. The third step is conscious training of thinking. Like any habits, anxious reactions are formed over the years, but they can be replaced by more healthier examples. Instead of immediately falling into worry, you can learn to first ask yourself questions. Is this a real problem or my interpretation? Can I do anything right now? Rebuilding the internal perception of anxiety requires time and practice, but it gives real freedom. When we start seeing anxiety not as an obstacle, but as an opportunity to better understand ourselves, we stop being as prisoners. This is the key step to emotional maturity and inner peace. Changing the attitude towards anxiety requires not only awareness, but also a willingness to work with yourself on a deep level. We are used to considering anxiety as a danger signal, as something from which we need to urgently get rid of. But what if instead of fighting, we accept it as a temporary state that does not carry a valuable lesson in itself? Jung argued that anxiety is the result of an internal conflict between conscious desires and suppressed aspects of personality. When we do not want to notice our fears, when we avoid complex emotions or suppress real desires, anxiety becomes a bridge between the conscious and the unconscious. It points us to what requires awareness and integration. Restructuring the perception of anxiety begins with realizing that it is not something permanent. Anxious thoughts come and go, but they do not determine who we are. It is important to remember that anxiety is not your personality, but simply a temporary state that can be observed from the side. Mindfulness plays a key role in this process. When anxious thoughts appear, it is important not to suppress them and not try to run away from them, but to ask yourself a few questions. What exactly am I feeling? What is this anxiety trying to tell me? Is this a real threat or just a habitual scenario of thinking? It creates an illusion of control. We think that if we worry about something long enough, we can better prepare for it or change the situation. But in reality, it's like running in circles. The mind spends enormous energy on anxious thoughts without bringing us closer to a solution. Another important tool is a change of perspective. Often, anxiety increases when we look at the situation from the position of fear and possible losses. But if we consciously try to see an anxiety an opportunity for growth, if we perceive it as training for the mind, it will cease to be a paralyzing factor. Jung emphasized that anxiety weakens when we stop fighting it and begin to perceive it as part of life. Instead of trying to avoid uncertainty, we learn to accept it. Instead of fearing the future, we realize that we are able to cope with any circumstances. This transition from resistance to acceptance takes time, but it gives an incredible sense of freedom. When anxiety ceases to be an enemy, but becomes a compass indicating important inner aspects, we cease to live in fear of it. Anxiety is something that everyone faces, but few really understand its nature. We are used to thinking that worry is just a reaction to external circumstances, but Jung showed that it is much deeper. It is related to our perception of the world, to our shadows, to those parts of personality that we do not want to acknowledge. Worry does not have to be a lifelong sentence. It does not mean that there is something wrong with us, and it is not a sign of weakness. On the contrary, anxiety is an invitation to look inside yourself, understand what really worries us, and realize what changes are necessary. True freedom does not begin when anxiety disappears forever. This is impossible, but when we stop being its prisoners, when we understand that we can experience anxiety, but not put chinyatsa to it, when we learn to accept it, realize its signals, and transform it into strength. Ultimately, it all comes down to how much we trust ourselves and life. We cannot control every detail of the future, but we can always control our reaction, and this gives us real confidence. If this text resonated with you, think about what anxieties control you right now. What will happen if you stop fighting them and start seeing in them an opportunity for growth? This path is the path of awareness, acceptance, and inner freedom. Are you ready to take the first step?